hi those who've joined so far. Hopefully we will have a few more. I'll introduce myself properly in a moment, but I thought it might be useful first of all just to talk through what we're going to be discussing today. So this all important journey of how to launch a new product or service. Because I think it's very tricky actually taking an idea from that concept stage to an actual launch, and it can feel like quite an overwhelming journey, which is why I think for many people it remains just that. It remains an idea, a what if, and many people don't move it past that concept stage. So hopefully today's all about breaking that journey down a little bit into key stages or steps, which you can see up on the slide there. And it's really about helping you to design that roadmap from concept to market. And you'll see a lot of these topics. Some of them you will have covered already in some of your previous sessions. Some you'll be covering in more depth in sessions coming up. So they're all quite meaty topics in themselves and probably deserve an entire webinar. So what we're going to be doing today is just taking some of the kind of key actions that you need to take in all of these areas. You can then take those away, hopefully at the end of the session, and follow up in a bit more detail. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. But in terms of me and my background, so yeah, I'm Ashley Cavers, and I'm a business advisor with Oxlep. I've worked on a number of their startup and growth programs over the last few years, and I'm currently managing one of their programs. I think Roddy, you probably know about, and possibly a few others. And that's the Escalate program, which is supporting social enterprises, charities, and impact businesses across Oxfordshire. But as Ant's already alluded, probably most relevant to today's topic, and why I'm really excited to be part of this startup support club, is because I'm actually a business owner and a startup myself. So alongside my co-founders, I've gone through and applied those 10 steps to launch my own range of products as the Wonky Food Company. So you may or may not have heard of us. We're still quite small, but just in a nutshell, the Wonky Food Company makes products from imperfect and surplus fruit and veg, so helping to tackle the huge problem of food waste. We launched about 3 years ago now, and we're stocked in the Co-op on Ocado, and also a growing number of independent retailers across the UK. So I'm not telling you that to do a plug for my business, although if you like relish, do go buy them because they're lovely. But really it's to make that point that I've been exactly where you are now, and I understand a lot of the challenges of taking that initial idea and turning it into a living, breathing business. So hopefully as we go through the steps to launch today, I'll be able to relate a few exact examples of what we did on that same journey, and hopefully bring the whole process to life just a little bit more for you. Okay. Right, so I'm going to take it that everybody here today has an idea, and you're probably at various different stages with that idea. But hopefully, what you realise early on, that it's one thing having that idea, but quite another thing being able to have a viable idea that can be turned into a product or service that a customer or client wants to buy. So the very first step on this journey is to be able to articulate your idea or your offer, and to explain what value it brings to the customer. And this is known as your value proposition. Now, I think you probably touched upon this in an earlier session, but I think it's really, really important to emphasize and worth recapping again here, because it can inform so many other aspects of your business. Now, another way of looking at a value proposition is, what is the problem that you are aiming to solve? Because all businesses need to be able to start with that simple question. So in its simplest form, you can actually turn a value proposition into a formula. So we help X do Y by doing Z. So at Wonky, for example, we help socially conscious consumers reduce food waste by making tasty food surplus relishes. So at this stage, it doesn't have to be a catchy tagline. It's more of a mission statement that you can refine over time. Now, much more well known than us, of course, is Airbnb, which in its words describes itself as existing to create a world where anyone can belong anywhere, providing healthy travel that is local, authentic, diverse, inclusive and sustainable. So that's quite a hefty list of value statements. And over time, they've managed to distill this into a simple but very effective tagline of Airbnb, belong anywhere. And Facebook, of course, we've all heard of Facebook. It's all about helping users to connect and share through technology. And companies such as Facebook can have more than one value proposition. So it might offer a different value proposition to its advertisers, for example, than to its end users, who are you and I. So it has a B2B and a B2C value proposition. So bear that in mind if that applies to your business. So if you haven't done this already, I'd really recommend taking a little bit of time just to try and articulate your own value proposition and apply this formula to your own idea, because it really will help with clarity and focus around your business. And it also comes into its own a bit later on in our steps today, when you need to think about areas such as your brand image and your marketing messages. Okay, so that's your value proposition. Now, once you've articulated that value proposition, you need to find if it has legs. Some of the best ideas start as a hunch or an assumption, but at some point that hunch needs to be tested and also validated. Just because you think it's a problem that needs solving doesn't mean that everybody else does. Of course, you don't need everybody to need your product or service, but you do need enough people to make it viable. So a thorough initial market research stage is really important for your business. This is the first stage of research, and later on today we're also going to be looking at how you need to do a second follow-up stage of market testing, where you actually develop a prototype of your product or service. But at this stage, you just need to identify that there is a potential market to warrant taking your idea to the next stage. So to start your research, you need to identify your target customers or customer. So these are the customers who are ultimately going to buy your product or service, and you need to get to know them really, really well. So are they men? Are they women? Perhaps both. How old are they? Whereabouts do they live? Perhaps you have more than one target market for your product or service. This detailed customer profiling is really important for properly understanding your market. But it's one thing establishing that there is a market for your product or service, but what if somebody has beaten you to it and got there first? So before you get too carried away with your idea, you need to be very clear about who your competitors are and how you fit in to the existing marketplace. You might have discovered that you've identified a gap in the market, in which case that's fantastic news and you've got an immediate competitive advantage by being the first to market. But that in itself can bring challenges, as the demand for your product or service hasn't yet been proven. Sometimes it can actually be better being second or third to market, because that way you've let that pioneer brand ahead of you go out there and test the waters, make mistakes potentially, and learn lessons which you can then benefit from. So I guess what I'm saying is, don't be put off just because someone else is already doing your idea or something similar to your idea. The key is to identify where you can do things better or differently. So that brings us to your USP, your unique selling point. And this can sometimes be quite similar to your value proposition, but essentially it's identifying what your point of difference is. So what sets you apart from your competitors? This may be that you are cheaper. It could be that the opposite end, you're a more luxury version of something that's already on the marketplace. You may decide that you want to compete on something like customer service, or perhaps it's through your delivery model that you're doing something a bit differently. So, for example, maybe you can be the first company to deliver a service online or as a subscription service. So how do you go about finding out all this important information about your customers and your competitors? Well, there are lots of very accessible ways of doing your research. Some well-crafted, well-thought-out internet searches can provide a whole host of useful data. But what might be useful is just talking you through how we did it at Wonky. So this is actually a slide taken from one of our original pitch decks when we were pitching an idea to other people. Now, when we started our market research for Wonky, this was actually before food waste was as high on the agenda as it is now. But we had started to read about what a huge problem food waste was, and the truth about the level of supermarket waste in particular was starting to come out in news reports. So we were pretty confident that there was a problem there that needed fixing. But what we couldn't say for sure was how ready the consumer was to play a role in fixing that problem. I mean, we had a hunch. We assumed that people wanted to do something about this. But as I said, a hunch isn't enough. We needed evidence to be able to back that up. So, in an area like food and drink, along with many other retail and consumer goods sectors, there is a lot of great market research already out there. You've probably heard of big companies such as Mintel or Nielsen, which is just on our doorstep here in Oxford. Now, these companies conduct really extensive research into consumer trends and patterns of behaviour. But of course, the catch is, you guessed it, you've usually got to part with a few £1,000s to be able to access it. So a quick tip to save you some pennies is to get a free membership to the British Library in London. Apart from being an amazing place to visit anyway, it has a fantastic business centre, business and IP centre, where you can access for free pretty much every single piece of market research that's ever been done. I was actually there on Saturday doing some research to help us with deciding our next product range. I know how to have fun on my weekends. So we spent a lot of time doing that research using resources like the British Library. And we had that hunch that people did want to buy more sustainably. But by being able to do that next level of research, we were able to find that, for example, in 2018, one Mintel report found that 83% of grocery shoppers believed it's important that we all cut back on food waste. Another report found that half of UK consumers interviewed found that buying ethical food and drink made them feel good. We were also able to access data around the size of the relish and condiments market and also determine the fact that it was growing. So this more formal data backed up those assumptions and hunches and increased our confidence to then be able to take our idea one step further. So when it came to looking at our competitors, what we did was draw up a market map, which you can see here. And the way we mapped it was looking at budget brands versus premium brands in the market, and also mainstream versus specialists. So specialist in our case were other environmental or ethical brands. So I would suggest trying to draw up, if you haven't done so already, try and draw up a market map like this for your sector that you're working in, just to really make sure that you understand the other players in your market. And when we did this, we quickly discovered that we did have a direct competitor. So there was somebody already out there making relishes out of surplus fruit and veg. So at that point, we could have said, okay, game over, someone's beaten us to it, let's find another idea. But actually, the effect for us was the opposite, because that other business, that competitor business, was in fact doing really well, growing really fast, getting investment, which indicated that there was demand out there in the marketplace. We'd also done our research into the size of the relish market, and we were fairly confident that there was room enough for both of us. But what it also did, looking at our competitors, was help us to identify that all-important point of difference, or USP. And for us, that was in our branding. We decided to be a bit more colourful, more obviously wonky in our messaging. We also emphasised things like our relationships with our farming partners, which was less obvious with our competitors. So after you've done this initial desktop research phase, this could be one of those points where you need to take a step back and ask yourself a few questions. So what does your research tell you? Is the market big enough for your product or service? Is there enough demand out there? Is your idea different enough to what is out there already? So all of these questions are relative. I appreciate that many people may just be wanting to create a lifestyle business, something that can serve as a second income, and you may not be put off by the fact that your target market is quite small. Big is absolutely not always best. So if you've identified what return you need out of your business, you can still build a really rewarding venture on a small scale. However, this might also be reality check time, because if you can't find any evidence that there is an obvious problem that needs solving, and if you're struggling to see how you can improve on an existing product or service, then this could be a point where it's wise to press pause. But I do want to be clear about this, because I think knowing when to stop or to switch to another idea is the sign of a really good entrepreneur. So somebody who doesn't let their heart rule their head. And I think as well, if you've come up with one idea, it's also very likely that you will have another, and one of them will make it past this initial market research testing phase. So don't be disheartened if that's the case with you. However, I am going to confidently assume that everybody here in the room today has fantastic ideas that absolutely warrant going through to the next stage of our 10 steps to launch. And that next stage is prototyping. So a prototype, to use the dictionary definition there, is an early sample, model, or release of a product built to test a concept or a process. Now, you might associate prototypes with tech or manufacturing, but every product or service should have a prototyping phase. And this is where you create that first version or a minimum viable product, an MVP, of your idea. And so why is it important to create a prototype? Well, there are many benefits. Some of these up on the screen there. So you can demonstrate, it's a great way of demonstrating to customers to gain feedback and make improvements early on. It's also a way of identifying any early design problems. It's also really helpful to help you clarify those production costs and processes. How much does it cost you to actually make that product? And in some sectors, a prototype is essential if you're wanting to attract some early stage investment. But there is a misconception that a prototype needs a lot of money and takes a lot of time. And while this is obviously true for some high tech or mission critical products, where obviously you need a basic proof that the tech actually works, for many products and services, a far more rudimentary approach is fine. So I would recommend taking a look at Google's rapid prototyping videos, which you can find on YouTube, which are very entertaining. You get some of Google's brightest and best people explaining how to prototype just using bits of paper and glue and card. I've also seen people make prototypes just out of Lego. But if you want to be a little bit more sophisticated than that, then why not try approaching your local design college, for example? We've got lots of very smart students here in Oxfordshire, and there may be somebody who you can work with on a prototype, possibly using something like 3D printing, if that's appropriate. There are also lots of digital tools to help you with prototyping as well. So if you have a quick look online, sites like mockups.com is a really cool example of how you can do a prototype. I should also probably point out at this stage that here at Oxlep, we also have our innovation support for business programme. So if your idea is in the tech or the innovation space, then we might well be able to actually provide you with some initial prototyping and research support. So you might think prototyping only works for physical products as well. And if you are in the room and you have an idea for a service, then you can actually use the prototyping principles for your idea as well. So for example, using storyboards or even doing some video role play to capture that whole customer journey and user experience. So this is still relevant to you. But the key thing to remember about prototyping is that it shouldn't cost loads of money, and it should be quick as well. So to give you a real life example of how we prototyped at Wonky, so we made the original relishes in our kitchen. We bought jars from Amazon. We designed and printed the sticky labels ourselves on a home printer. And of course, we knew that this wasn't going to be the product that we eventually went to market with if we ever got that far in the first place. But we wanted something tangible that our potential customers could see and feel, and of course, in our case, taste. So we used these jars to try out the products on friends and family. We joined a startup accelerator very early on here in Oxford, and we got other startup businesses to also try our relishes, often using them in blind tastings against other real shop shelf brands. But while the end user, so the shopper, you and I, were one customer, the other customers that we had to think about for our prototyping phase were the stores that we needed to sell our product in the first place. And the first customer we approached was the co-op, the supermarket. And we approached them really early on at our prototyping stage. And they were interested enough in the concept to invite us into their offices for a chat. And obviously, for that meeting, it was crucial that we had a version of our relishes to take in with us. It gave them something to taste, it gave them something to visualize. They also knew it wasn't the finished thing. And they actually were then able to make suggestions about the branding, about the shape of the jars. And of course, they gave us feedback on the taste of the product as well. So that meeting was then enough for them to say that they would be interested in stocking us once we'd gone away and then built our new improved version. So I guess the point I'm making here is that by having gone through that prototype phase, by having a prototype to take to those early customers, it then gave us the confidence and reassurance we needed to be able to invest in the next stage in some proper branding and to look for a manufacturer who could produce the relish to scale. But just imagine if we hadn't done that, and if we'd gone ahead and confidently produced our relishes, spent a fortune on branding, and then tried to have that meeting with a co-op or another supermarket, and they'd actually turned around and said, well, we hate the name, we don't like the colours you're using, or we're really not sure they're the right flavours, then that would have been a huge setback and an awful waste of money. So by doing it this way round, having the prototype first, we could get that all-important feedback to make sure that we were on the right track. Okay, so once you have your prototype, then you can do that all-important next stage of market research that I mentioned earlier, and that's market testing. So I've just mentioned how at Wonky we used our prototype to test out on potential customers. And with a prototype to hand, you can test things like the look, the feel, the colour, the whole usability of your product. It's also where you can refine and further test some of those assumptions from your earlier round of market research, such as the price point. So how much is your customer prepared to pay? And also your delivery model. So that's where and how people can buy your product or service. So testing on friends and family is one thing, but that's not enough because you simply can't guarantee their objectivity and they may not actually be in your target market to begin with. But some other ways in which you can test your products include independent focus groups. So focus groups are an age-old, tried and tested way of getting initial customer feedback. And you can go out and find plenty of agencies where you can spend lots of money to convene your perfect target market sample group. But there's no reason at all why you can't create your own focus group where the results will be just as valid. So, for example, if you're designing a product or a service, say for preschoolers, perhaps for a new drinking cup or a sensory toy of some sort, then why not ask permission to visit a local parent and toddler group and get them to try out your product prototype and then capture all of their comments and their feedback. Also, make sure that you do your market testing in places where you have a lot of people. Now, obviously, that's been quite hard to do recently, but if you, like us, have a food or drink product, then farmers markets and also festivals. I was at a festival over the weekend at Blenheim, so they are starting up again. Then those are perfect places to go to get feedback from customers. And something that we did quite a bit of actually in the early days of Wonky was going along to pitching competitions. So this is where we turn up, talk to a room full of complete strangers about our idea. And that was a great way of getting immediate feedback and also further validating our idea, as well as importantly helping to hone those pitching skills, which will certainly come in handy later on. And one of those competitions we actually won, which gave us just enough money to be able to pay for a professional branding company. And I'll just mention here as well that if anybody in the room today is developing a product or a service that you think has a particular environmental or social impact, then through Oxlep and the Escalate programme that I mentioned earlier, we've actually got some applications open at the moment for a pitching competition that we're running. So there's going to be some pitch training later on this month, and then a pitching final next month, where there'll be a cash prize up for grabs. as well as some impact angel investors being invited along to the event. So it's quite exciting. I think Ant will probably send you a link if you are interested in finding out a bit more. Then in the follow-up email to today's session, we can send you a link so you can find out more and sign up. I think the closing application window is quite soon. So if you are interested, want more information, then make sure you take a look. And then finally, another way of validating your idea is to see if people will buy your service or product even before you've launched it. So a way of doing this is by creating a landing page, an online landing page. You can then run some ads through Google Ads or Facebook ads, and then have a buy now button, which you have on that landing page, and simply see how many people click through to buy or find out more information about your product or service. If you have people wanting to buy, then you've immediately validated your product. So those are just a few examples, and there are many, many other ways as well of testing your product or service. Okay, so hopefully by this point, sort of halfway through your steps to launch, your confidence is hopefully growing in your product. You've validated your idea, you know you're onto something. So at this point, it is worth just taking a moment to make sure that you've protected your idea and that it remains your property. So intellectual property, or IP, can get quite complicated, and it varies according to what kind of product or service that you have. So I'll put a quick disclaimer in here and say that I am not an IP lawyer. So anyone wanting to find out more about IP should visit the UK Intellectual Property Office. The website's just up on the slide there. And that they have some really useful, easy to understand guides. And there's also a page with some handy summaries and links on the Oxlet Business website as well. But very broadly speaking, IP falls into four main categories: patents, design, trademarks, and copyright. So patents protects new inventions, how they work, what they do, what they're made of, and how they're made. Designs protects the overall look of a product, including the colour, shape, the texture, and the material. Trademarks, which is probably most relevant to those in the room today, that protects your brand, so your business name or logo, for example, and it can consist of a word or a phrase or a picture, and sometimes a combination of all of those. And then finally, copyright, which is more about protecting written, dramatic, and artistic works. And it's also worth saying that you can take out multiple types of IP on a single product or service. So at Wonky, as soon as we knew that we were serious about taking our product to market, and actually in our case, before we even got to that prototyping stage, we trademarked the use of the word wonky with respect to misshapen fruit and vegetables. And we did the original registration ourselves. It was all fairly straightforward, although we did have to use lawyers a bit further down the line when we actually had to defend our trademark in a few cases. So not everybody will have IP that can be protected, and the patent process in particular can actually be quite long-winded and arduous. So if you've got a tech product, for example, I've met many tech firms over the years who haven't even bothered with the patenting process because things move so quickly in the world of technology. You'd have to be taking out constant patents for every iteration of your product. So often, as with many things in business, the value is more in speed of getting to market first, rather than getting bogged down with too much IP. But I thought it was just worth mentioning that at this point in case you do have a great idea that is worth protecting. Okay, so on to step number 6, your business model. So I am going to assume that the majority of the people in the room today, because we're in a startup club, that you've either already started your business or you are thinking of starting up a business. So that might be as a sole trader or a private limited company, or perhaps some of you are exploring the social enterprise route and want to set up as a community interest company, for example. So all of these are very valid ways of setting up a business. But I'm also going to work on the assumption that many of you will be planning on managing most of the elements of the business yourself, perhaps making your product from your kitchen table or garden shed, or delivering your service from your home office. And the reason I assume that is simply because that's how most businesses actually start out. But it is worth pausing for a moment just to note that there are different routes to get your product or service to market, not just the DIY route. Because it's important to be honest, setting up a business is a lot of work. Especially with a product business, you've got your manufacturing, your packaging, your distribution that you need to think of. If lots of people end up buying your products, which you hope they will, then you're soon going to grow and you won't be able to work from your kitchen table anymore. So even further down the line, if things are going well, you'll also probably need to employ other people to help you. You may also need premises as well. You'll need a sales and marketing strategy to be able to help you reach more customers. The list goes on and on. Now, for many people, this is all part and parcel of running a business, and it's all part of the joy and satisfaction, not just creating the product, but everything else that goes with it. But another route, if that doesn't appeal to you, is to start outsourcing all of these various functions from an early stage in your business. So you can outsource production to a contract manufacturer. You can outsource your sales and marketing to a freelancer. Now, all of this will be a more expensive way to launch your business, as you need to cover the costs of that outsourcing. But bringing in expertise early on can get you to market more quickly. It can potentially increase your chance of success, and also means that you can focus on the product and the ideas side of the business, if that is truly where your passion lies. And the other option that's just worth mentioning briefly is licensing your product or service. So you might decide, for example, that you've done all of that initial research phase, you've done the prototyping, you've designed your product or come up with a service idea, you've filed any of your patents or copyrights or trademarks that you need to, but then you simply don't have the time or the money or perhaps the interest in taking that next step of launching that product or service idea to market. In which case, you can either see if you can sell your idea outright, or perhaps you can license it to another company which already has the resources and the capacity in place. And then in return, you would get paid a royalty. So the downside of licensing is that you lose control of how the business is run and what the other company will do with your idea, and you're unlikely to get any of the potential glory from any success from that product. But for some people, it's a lower effort route, it's a lower risk route of getting your product to market. So I just wanted to point out that there are alternatives so that you're clear that you don't have to do everything yourself to get your product to market. Okay, so one of the factors that may help you decide whether you take your idea to market yourself or you hire in others to do it or license it is, of course, money. Now, I think you're going to be looking at cash flow and accessing finance and those sorts of things in another session, if you haven't already. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about that side of finance here. But in the context of today, I just wanted to talk through how you look at your costs in order to help you price your product or service ahead of your launch, because this can be another critical decision point when it comes to determining viability of your venture. So if you're a product-based business, then this simple pricing formula gives you an overview of how to decide what to sell your product for. So first of all, you need to look at your material costs. This is sometimes known as your cost of goods or your COG. And this is basically what it costs you to make that product so that it's ready to sell. So in the case of our little jars at Wonky, it was the cost of the raw materials to actually make the relish, so the fruit and veg, but it was also the glass jar, it was the labels that we had to print to put on the jar, and also the cost of manufacturing that product as well. Now, on top of that, you then have to factor in labour. So that's either your wage or others that you might employ or outsource to. Now, it is a brutal truth that many people don't pay themselves at first when they're building up their business. But the important thing to remember is that you are presumably going to want to pay yourself at some point. So your business model at this stage has to at least factor in the room to be able to pay yourself. So after labour, you then need to look at your running costs. So these are other expenses such as your packaging, your postage, your distribution costs. How are you going to get your products to your customer? As well as all of the things like sales and marketing and other day-to-day overheads and expenses such as rent, if you're renting premises, electricity and IT costs and so forth. And also don't forget, because lots of people do, to add in a little extra for your profit margin. This enables you to be able to continue to reinvest in the business and to put money aside, and also gives you a little bit of flexibility if you're using a wholesale model to get your product to market. Excuse me, doing much too much talking. Now, a bit like early on, after the initial market research phase, this could be another one of those points in the journey where you need to just take a step back and do a little bit of a reality check. So, excuse me, let's take that toddler drinking cup or sensory toy idea from earlier. So you may have done all of your testing, you've taken on all of that feedback, you've designed the most beautiful toddler product in the world. But if the costs involved in making and shipping that product means you have to sell that toy or drinking cup for £40 in order to cover all of your material and running costs before you even factor in the profit, then you know it's not going to work, because nobody, however beautifully engineered and designed it is going to buy a toddler drinking cup for £40. So similarly, if you're offering a new service, you have to know what people are prepared to pay for your expertise or your service, which is hopefully something that you've established in that earlier market research stage. And then it's a case of figuring out whether you can generate enough clients at that price point to be able to generate the turnover you need to cover your costs and also pay you a wage as well. And if the numbers don't add up, which they may not do at the first attempt, then it doesn't mean that you have to give up on your idea. It just means that you need to go and crunch your numbers a bit further and examine your business model. So, for example, can you use a cheaper ingredient or material in your product? Is there a more cost efficient way to sell your service to the customer? So, delivering your support online, for example, which many people have been doing during the recent lockdowns, which is a far more time and cost efficient way than traveling 2 hours to meet your clients face to face. So it might be a bit of a case of going back to the drawing board for some elements of your business, but that is another test of being a good entrepreneur, always looking for different ways to innovate and make your product viable. Okay, so while the numbers are obviously very crucial, it has to be said that it's not as much fun talking about the numbers as it is talking about branding, which is step 8 in our preparations for getting launch ready. So if you want your product or service to get noticed and make an impact at launch, then you do need a strong brand. And a lot of the work that you've done up to this point is going to help shape that brand. So things like your value proposition, your target customer, the responses that you've had to your prototyping and your research are all going to help inform the look, the feel, and the tone of your brand. So on this slide that I've got up, these are just a few examples of some of the brand concepts, the designs that we tried early on at Wonky before deciding on our final design, which we have now, which hopefully you agree is a lot better than those early versions. And I just want to share very briefly an important lesson that I learned through the whole branding process. And that is that it can be a bit of a rabbit hole. It's very easy to spend a whole load of time and a whole load of money trying to come up with a perfect brand. In our case, we spent almost a year from start to finish with our brand, and it shouldn't have taken that long. In something like food and drink, branding is very important, more important than some other sectors, because you've got to be able to stand out on the shop shelf. But depending on what you're selling and where you're selling it, you don't need to hire a big shiny agency and spend lots of money. I've seen some fantastic home designed brands, and you can also find some low cost alternatives online, platforms such as Fiverr or 99 Designs. They have freelance graphic designers who can create a logo for you in days or even hours in some cases, and on a very small budget as well. It's also important to understand that branding is not just about a logo or design. itself. That is part of it, but arguably more important is your brand identity, what you stand for as a brand. So, what's your personality? What's your story? What's the story behind you and your product or service? Because every new business, whether you know how to tell that story yet or not, does have a story behind their brand. And being able to tell that story effectively is really going to help you with a successful launch, because it's going to attract interest. It's going to attract interest from your customers, first and foremost, but also from journalists and other key partners and stakeholders. For us, for example, customers like the Co-op were a very important first customer, and they were happy to take a chance on a completely unknown brand because they liked the story that we had to tell. So they loved the fact that we were providing equal rights for all fruit and veg. They liked the fact that we were a family business. It was started by my brother and myself. They liked the fact that we worked with farmers. Once you've identified those crucial elements of your brand identity, this is really going to help to inform your marketing and your messaging when it comes to actually launching that new idea onto the world. Okay, so you're getting closer to the launch itself by this point, and what I would say is careful planning is absolutely crucial, because by this point in the journey, you're going to be juggling a lot of different elements and you need to be super organized. I find it really helpful for one-off projects such as a launch, but also for day-to-day management, to use a visual planning tool. So you may use these already. You may have come across something like Asana or Trello. They're cloud-based planners, but really helpful for that kind of project management piece. But today, just in terms of a high-level checklist, up on the slide now are some of my top tips based on my personal experience, but also working with other businesses and brands over the years. So some top tips to achieving a successful launch. So number one, choosing a launch date. Now, that might sound blindingly obvious, but choosing the right time to launch your product or service is really important. So, for example, you don't want to be launching a new swimwear range at this time of year, just as it's starting to get cold and nobody wants to go away on holiday, or planning a local launch in your community right in the middle of a school holiday when loads of people may have gone away. It's also worth having a look to see if you can find a hook or an event to hang your launch on. So by that, I mean, so for example, if you were about to launch, say, a new mindfulness app, you could pick something like National Stress Awareness Day or Mental Health Day. You're much more likely to be able to generate interest from local media or national press if they can find that all important newsworthy angle to your product or service launch. It's also worth considering as well whether you actually want to do a full-blown bells and whistles launch. For some businesses, and actually this probably applies more to service businesses rather than product businesses, just doing a soft launch can actually be a really good idea. So a soft launch is where you open the doors to your business, but very quietly. So you use it as an opportunity to test your delivery model, to get further feedback from your first customers and make some of those mistakes, which we all make early on in a business, but without the whole world watching. You can then always do a bigger launch later on when you have that complete confidence in your model and you make sure you've ticked all of the boxes. So once you've chosen your launch date, make sure you build a buzz. So I can't emphasize this point enough, really. Many businesses, they make the mistake of waiting until the very last minute when they have everything lined up and ready. So they've got their website sorted, got their Instagram and their Facebook and all their other social media ready. And then they press go all at once. But the problem there is that you're then operating from a standing start. So remember a little earlier on, I mentioned that in that market testing and validation stage, the benefits of having something like a landing page where you can test interest in your product. At the same time as doing that, so it could be weeks or even months before the actual launch of your product, you can also start up your social media accounts. So have an Instagram page or a Facebook group and start to build some interest around your product and your brand. with branding and with new businesses, it's all about creating that sense of excitement of coming soon and watch this space. And if you're already building customer leads in the form of followers and likes, that's going to help you when you actually hit the ground running. And make sure, for example, on your landing page or on your Instagram page, you have an option for people to sign up to a mailing list so that you can keep them posted about when it comes to finally announcing your launch. So next on the checklist is check the detail. And by this, I mean, make sure you have planned for absolutely everything. Because once you've launched, you're out there, you're in the marketplace, the world is watching, and you'll be judged not just on your product, the quality of your product and service, but everything that goes along with it. So that's the customer service. So do you have an email that people can contact you with questions, for example? Have you got a returns policy for your products? I know of a company that launched a brand new product on its website but hadn't checked if that product could fit into its existing postal boxes. And of course, it didn't. So the company then couldn't fulfill any of the initial orders and had to spend a fortune getting some new customized boxes designed, which really impacted then on its profit margins. And it's also really important. So there may be some of you who are going to be selling online. E-commerce is a huge boom area at the moment. So what I would say is make sure you do a test run in the post with your product, send it out to friends and family, make sure it gets there in one piece. What do they think of the packaging when they open it up? Could it be better? Could you do something a little bit more personalized, like a handwritten note in with your first products sent out to your customers? It's that sort of thing that I mean when I say check the detail. So next on the list is writing your marketing plan for launch. Now, we could spend an entire hour here just talking about the marketing because there is so much to cover, which is why it is great to have a plan where you write down all of that detail. So, for example, what social media channels are you going to use? You don't need to use all of them. LinkedIn is more important for some businesses. It's not relevant at all for others. Similarly, Instagram is fantastic for product businesses. But if you're a service business, is it really going to help you? Not necessarily. So don't feel like you have to be on every single channel. Choose the ones that work for you. Are you going to be paying for advertising to help with your launch, for example? Maybe you're going to set aside some budget for some Facebook or some Google ads. What is your budget? Have you figured that out? Do you know which magazine editors or bloggers or influencers that you want to send some free samples to ahead of your launch? Perhaps you're going to have a launch party, or maybe you'll offer some promotions or giveaways to your first 50 customers. These are all the little things that you need to think about and can include as you're writing your marketing plan. In terms of a launch marketing strategy, it really is just about making sure you have all of your bases covered and those timings planned. Then finally on the list, find an ambassador or ambassadors for your product. So this might be an early influential customer. In our case, as I've already mentioned, it was the co-op. So our launch event was actually tied into going onto the shelves of the first co-op store. But an ambassador could be a professional endorsement or a partnership. So if you've invented, for example, a new pet product, could you get one of the pet owners associations to endorse it with a short launch video for you to use on your social media channels? Or back to that mindfulness app idea, could you approach a celebrity perhaps who's been very public about their own mental health issues? Perhaps they'd be happy to say something nice about your product or feature it on their Instagram feed. It's all about reaching out to anybody you can think of who can help make some noise when you launch. So whether that's celebrities or bloggers or social media influencers, identify those people who align with your brand and your brand values and reach out to them. And I have to say, you will be surprised, as I was, that it is the natural instinct of most people to help other people. And right now, especially, there is such a lot of support for small independent businesses and entrepreneurs such as yourselves. So that's us almost at the end now, but just brings us to the actual launch itself. But of course, the launch isn't the end at all. It's just the beginning of your business. And probably the most important piece of advice at this stage is simply not to take your foot off the pedal. It is quite possible, as it was in our case, that it's taken you months to get to this point, maybe even years. And the temptation is then to think, phew, done it. We've created something. We've got it to market. Aren't we amazing? Ta-da. And of course, it is a fantastic achievement for anybody to actually get a product or a new service to market. And you should definitely, revel in that moment and enjoy it. However, the real challenge is now to be able to build on that whole buzz that you've created around your launch. It's about engaging with those very first customers that you've attracted and making sure they come back and buy from you again and again, and that they also go on and tell others about your product or service. But yes, customer attraction and retention is definitely a topic for another webinar. So I hope that's been useful for you. I'm just going to finish on a slide that just has a picture of me on launch day. So that was when we launched our relishes into the co-op up in Chipping Norton, which was very exciting. But yes, the hard work certainly doesn't stop. I can attest to that. But yes, I don't know if anybody has any questions after the result of that. Anything you'd like me to expand on in a bit more detail? And I don't know if you've had a chance to look at the chat. I'm always rubbish at being able to chat and talk at the same time, I'm afraid.
I can tell you that there's nothing in the chat at all, Ashley.
I've answered everybody's questions.
I'm not sure whether everybody discovered it, but yeah, questions, thoughts about what Ashley's just been sharing.
Great. Is anybody else setting up a food or drink business? Or anybody want to talk a little bit about their business that they're starting? Don't worry if you don't. If it's still a confidential idea stage, then I understand you may not want to share.
I mean, you touched on elements. I mean, obviously, this is very product-led, what you've been describing. You were launching a product, and you touched on elements of, how this would be different for a service. Have you got examples of service businesses you've spoken to, supported, that have been through this, and what worked for them, what didn't?
I mean, I think, a lot of, and I've sort of tried, so you're right, my experiences of launching a product business. I've also run my own service businesses in the past as well. And a lot of these tips, a lot of this advice applies equally to a service business. But I think the key thing to bear in mind with a service business is that you need probably even more focus on the customer, and to really understand that whole customer engagement. So have a real deep dive into that customer profiling stage of really understanding who you're talking to, what are the problems, how is your business going to fix the problems that they have, and then to map through. So I think, prototyping is something that people do associate with just product businesses. But I have worked with businesses who've done some video role playing, where they've, somebody else in the business, in the startup team, has played the customer, the other person has played you, the service provider, and you literally go through that process from the first phone call to the first meeting. Perhaps you decide that as part of your customer experience and journey, you offer a free 10 or 15-minute sampling session of your service. I've worked with businesses where that has been really effective, as it's a great way of providing a low cost or no cost introduction to what you can offer as a service, and to then get them to come back and engage in a full hour session or longer session. So yes, it's really important not to skip the customer profiling and research and prototyping phases if you're a service business.
And I guess if you're entering a market where there are already competitors, then actually it's not quite prototyping, but going and experiencing their service wherever you can is a great way to learn about what you like, what you don't like, what you think your customers might like from it. So you almost tweak your own service model.
Completely. Just as, in our customer mapping, you remember that mapping exercise that I showed, we had to go out and taste all of the products. The equivalent in a service business is going out and experiencing other people's services as well, and really then scrutinizing on what is missing, putting yourself in the customer shoes, and how can you as that service provider improve the service. And we talked about a few ways. It might be how you deliver the service. Maybe you can deliver a more remote model of service rather than face to face, or maybe face to face is what people want now, and that in itself becomes your point of difference. It really is worth spending that time at that research phase. And yes, if you can get up close to your competitors, then all the better, as that's the way that you can really define how you can position yourself differently.
Fantastic. Question from Rupert. You've talked about contacting initial customers to get feedback and asking them to advocate. Can you do that with regards to GDPR if you've not already sought contact consent?
I mean, GDPR, oh, lovely subject. I think, if you've got existing customers who have signed up to a mailing list, if they've signed up, opted in to a mailing list, then you are GDPR compliant. So you can, quite happily, ask them to advocate on your behalf. But I think when I was talking about, your early customers as well. So in our case with the co-op, they obviously wanted to be able to shout about us. It was in their interests as much as it was in ours for them to talk about us, to advertise us. But I think also where I was mentioning, those ambassadors, getting people on board to advocate your product, all you can do is ask. You're not breaching any GDPR approaches and GDPR rules by just approaching them to say, hey, I'm a new business, I'm pioneering a product in this area, or I've got this new service which is really going to help people. There's nobody else like it out in the market. Would you like to try it? If you like it and you want to mention me, that would be brilliant. That's totally, no money is exchanging hands there. You're just asking them to review your product or endorse it if they would like to. And that's within GDPR rules.
Fantastic. If you're doing market research, so you're putting surveys out there and that, do you have preferred tools? SurveyMonkey, Google Forms, etc.?
Google Forms, I'm seeing SurveyMonkey used to be the kind of default go-to, but I really rate Google Forms. Actually, I think they've improved it a lot, and it's quite user-friendly. So either of those, I think I think SurveyMonkey now has more of a payment scale. It's been a little while since I used it, but I think to get some of the premium features, they do get you to pay more, whereas Google Forms is still fairly free or low cost to access and use. But yes, they're both really good ways of getting feedback. But for it to be viable, though, make sure you get a good sample. So if you only get 5 Google Forms, it's going to be really difficult to evidence demand on 5 responses. So you want to be able to hit a critical mass, really. Depends on your product, depends on your area, depends on the size of your market, what that magic number might be. But you're looking, I think, for at least 50 responses from any kind of online mapping exercise.
Fantastic. You mentioned the British Library and going and spending your Saturdays there, Ashley. Is there an online version of that?
I don't think there is. I know the British Library is starting to roll out. It's actually working with a number of the local enterprise partnerships. I believe there might be a bit of a watch this space with Oxlep on that. So they are connecting with regions, recognising how many people are starting up new businesses and what a useful tool that is to help people access affordable market research. So at the moment, that facility isn't here in Oxfordshire, and you do have to literally turn up to the British Library. You do have to go through a process of getting a reader's card, and you can't even actually print out anything at the library. They will then send you the documents that you need afterwards. But it is still really useful. I was there for 3-4 hours on Saturday, and I've got a whole stack now of information on various other product areas where we may be launching new products. But I would say make sure you're on the Oxlep mailing list, and as and when we manage to partner with British Library, we can keep you informed about that service.
Fantastic, thank you. that's it in the chat, unless anyone wants to unmute and ask any final questions. We're just 1 minute over, but I think Ashley's usually got a few minutes spare if anybody wants to ask anything. Alison, you look like you're on the edge of your seat and you're going to ask something. But you're on mute.
Hi. Yeah, I was just going to ask you about how to kind of find an ambassador, really. I suppose it's just looking on social media, and I mean, I'm looking for people that are interested in ethical trade and trade not aid with Africa, that kind of thing. But yeah,
well, there's lots of, in that ethical trading space, there are a lot. So I don't know what your product is, but just in terms of getting some early kind of coverage and exposure, is it a product, Alison, that you?
Yeah, it's basketware that's made in Ghana and that I've imported over here and that I wanted to sell now. Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. Well,
Yeah.
I'd say your first stage is to contact a lot of the ethical shopping platforms that are out there, if you haven't found those already. And there are a number of kind of influencers and people that, you know, blog and talk regularly about, you know, new ethical finds. And at this point in the run up to Christmas as well, there'll be people that will be starting to compile like ethical gifting guides as well.
Okay. Yeah.
So it's really worth it. It's worth kind of putting together like a one-pager about, you know, the product, its ethical credentials, why it's new, why it's different, you know, the story behind it, and why it would make such a wonderful gift for somebody, you know, this Christmas, and then send that out to you know, to those, you know, those journalists, those bloggers, those writers who focus on that whole ethical space. And some of the, you know, approach some of the, think about some of the nationals. You know, The Guardian is great with its magazine supplements, often does ethical gifting guides. So that would be one to approach.
Depends it depends how successful you want to be, Alison. As Ashley's describing that, I'm thinking, how much have you imported? Because this could go crazy, and then how do you cope with demand?
Well, yeah, not much at the moment, so I'm just kind of going to test it out first of all. But I know that they'll be on it if I needed a lot, and I can get it through in 2 weeks. So.
And then, you know, find if you're starting small as well, I mean, look for local retailers in Oxford and Oxfordshire. You know, there are some great shops and great businesses who look for ethical suppliers and turn up, knock on their door, show them a sample, say, would you be interested in stocking me? And then just work out your kind of wholesale pricing model for that, so that you can, because they obviously need to make some money from selling the product then as well. What will you sell it into them for?
There's a couple of fair trade shops. There's one in Headington, there's one in Oxford, isn't there? And there's Indigo on the
I was just going to say Indigo on the Cowley Road would be great, especially for those sort of fashion and accessory items. So certainly worth it. And just, you know, do a good old Google, you know, ethical retail stores, Oxfordshire, Buckinghamshire, Worcestershire, you know, go to all of those surrounding counties and give them a call, send them, make sure you've got lovely pictures of the products, ideally pictures of them being made in Ghana by whoever's, you know, making them. Because that's the whole storytelling piece, telling the story behind the product, which is so important.
Oh, thank you so much.
And don't forget Oxfam. You know, we're in Oxford, we've got Oxfam. Aim big. You know, they might need a new product like that, and you know, they're more likely to be supportive of a local supplier as well.